So many people lately have been moving from Florida to Georgia. So let's talk about some of the common complaints that I hear from people who are moving from Florida. We'll also talk about some of the benefits of living in Georgia. And I'll also tell you about my experience moving from Florida to Georgia. Let's go. What's up, y'all? My name is Victor. I'm a local real estate agent here in Georgia, and I put out weekly videos all about what it's like to live in Atlanta, Georgia, and the surrounding cities. If you're thinking about moving to Atlanta or you just want to know what it's like to live here, feel free to call or text anytime. Thank you so much to everyone who has reached out. I'm more than happy to help. But right now, let's talk about some of the common things that I hear from people who move from Florida to Georgia and some of the complaints that I hear about what it's like to live in Florida lately. Hands down, one of the most common things that I hear from people who are moving from Florida is that the cost of living in Florida is getting outrageously high. So many people who move from Florida tell me about the property taxes getting higher and the mortgages getting higher, home values getting higher, but employers not necessarily offering a pay that kind of keeps up with the inflation rate. And so that's really a common reason why many people are moving from the state of Florida to Georgia. Yes, there are certainly some parts of Georgia that have a better cost of living and home values that are a bit more affordable, but it's not all of the parts of Georgia. It's really only kind of certain pockets of Georgia. So what part of Georgia you move to is very important. And then another common one that I hear from people who are moving from Florida is that the homes there in Florida very often are like kind of similar or cookie cutter, especially homes that were built like in the last 20 to 30 years. People are always telling me about how those houses are like in neighborhoods where the whole neighborhood seems very similar, or like all of the houses are exactly the same. And so I think people are really getting away from that kind of style. I think that kind of style is becoming not so desirable anymore. So we certainly have a lot of homes here in Georgia that are not cookie cutter, but something to keep in mind is that those homes that are not cookie cutter here in Georgia tend to be, 30 or 40 or maybe even 50 years old. So something that comes along with those houses that have a lot of character is the houses that have a lot of problems. That's not really something that you hear about on HGTV. People like the homes that have a lot of character, but you certainly have to have a very thorough home inspection with those homes that are 30, 40 years old, because they tend to also come with lots of problems. And then people coming from Florida are also certainly complaining about the amount of traffic that there is in Florida, the amount of people, and then the amount of construction that's going on in Florida. Very often I hear that the construction in Florida is just never ending. It's all the time, everywhere. There seems to be new buildings, new construction. And so that's another reason why a lot of people seem to be wanting to leave the state of Florida. And then another common one is the school qualities. It kind of seems to be that in Florida, you can have a high home value, where your monthly mortgage is really high, but the school that is associated with your home does not have a very good rating, or it's a poor quality school. So that's another big reason why a lot of people seem to be leaving Florida. And so clearly there are lots of reasons why people are wanting to leave the state of Florida and come to Georgia, looking for a more family-friendly environment or lower cost of living or better school qualities. So let me tell you about my experience when I moved from the state of Florida to Georgia and what that was like, because there was really quite a bit of culture shock. There's some not only culture shock, but other kinds of things that are very surprising that happen here in Georgia. And so it's certainly something that you need to be aware of if you're thinking about moving to Georgia from the state of Florida. So it all kind of goes back to 1996 when Atlanta held the Olympic Games. That was really one of the biggest catalysts for the amount of growth that we had here in Atlanta. The Olympic Games put Atlanta on the map for the world to really recognize the benefits of Atlanta and the state of Georgia. And that meant that a lot of people started moving to Atlanta and the state of Georgia. So that also included my family and I. We also moved to Metro Atlanta around that same time, around 1996. And certainly one of the biggest things that is surprising when you get to Georgia from Florida right away is just the amount of green space and trees that we have here. It is just an overwhelming amount of trees. And it's not just the amount of trees, it's how tall the pine trees are here. Very often when you're driving down the roads here in Georgia, it's like you're driving it through the woods. Like there will be pine trees on your left, pine trees on your right, and you're just swallowed up by the pine trees, and it feels like you're driving through a forest. So the calmness or the peace that comes with that kind of lifestyle is sometimes surprising for many people who come to Georgia from the state of Florida. Something else that really surprised us when we moved here to Georgia from Florida is just that so many of the cities around Metro Atlanta are very family friendly. There are young families living all around Metro Atlanta, and that kind of has to do with the fact that some of the best schools and the best home values are not necessarily in the middle of Atlanta, but they are on the outskirts of Metro Atlanta. Sometimes I've talked about this in the videos in the past where Atlanta is kind of like a bubble, and in the middle you have the urban environment, you have all of the high-rise buildings, and all of the traffic is there in the middle of the city of Atlanta around Midtown or downtown, kind of at Buckhead as well. But as more people move to the city of Atlanta, that growth in Metro Atlanta kind of spreads out like a bubble or like a target. And so most of the growth that's happening in Metro Atlanta now happens really on the outskirts of Metro Atlanta, which is counties like Cobb County or Gwinnett County, maybe even Cherokee County, Forsyth County, Fayette County, Henry County. These really are the areas that are experiencing the most amount of growth. And because of that, that's really also where the young families are living. So if you move to any one of these areas of Metro Atlanta, you're going to find that one of the most common demographics in that part of Metro Atlanta is young families. This also means that you're going to find a very family-friendly kind of area. You're going to find lots of activities for everybody in the family. You're going to find schools that are very well rated. You're going to find home values that are more affordable because they're on the outskirts of Atlanta, not in the middle of Atlanta. And so that certainly was a big surprise and something that we were really happy about when we moved to Georgia. Something else that we might need to talk about that's kind of surprising here in Georgia is that Georgia and the city of Atlanta is really an international city, and it's one of the major cities really in the United States. And so I think a lot of times people in Florida kind of don't realize just how much racial diversity you can find here in Metro Atlanta. Remember that Atlanta has the busiest airport in the world and is one of the fastest growing metropolitan cities in the country. So Metro Atlanta does not really have like the hillbilly redneck feel of the 60s and 70s. It's not really like that anymore. Atlanta has certainly grown a lot, especially because of the Olympics and all of that international attention that has really shaped Atlanta significantly. And that kind of closed-minded redneck feel that a lot of people think of Atlanta is not really something that you would find here in Metro Atlanta anymore. Also, we can't forget about the climate, and that's probably one of the biggest reasons why so many people move to Georgia from Florida. We certainly have all 4 seasons here in Georgia. It's not like Florida where you have summer all year long and then maybe a couple weeks of fall. Here in Georgia, the temperatures certainly range quite a bit. In the summertime, the temperatures are going to get as high as 95 to 100 degrees. And we do have a lot of humidity here in Georgia, maybe not as much as Florida, but people here in Georgia are always complaining about the amount of humidity. So when you tie together that 95 degrees and the humidity, it certainly makes for a really hot summer. And then in the wintertime, the temperature gets as low as maybe 10 degrees on average. Here in the last few months, especially during the Christmas time of 2022, the temperature got about 5 degrees Fahrenheit, which was super surprising for so many people. In fact, I think that was the coldest temperature I've ever felt in my life, but that is really not normal for Georgia. The average low in the wintertime is probably closer to 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And then, of course, in the fall, you're going to see the leaves change colors. In the spring, you're going to see the blooming of all those trees. So it's very different all year long. We have all of the 4 seasons, which is a really big reason why so many people come to Georgia. Another big difference between living in Florida and living in Georgia is unquestionably the food that we have here in Georgia. In Georgia, you're going to get a very kind of Southern cuisine for the most part. We don't have really a lot of Caribbean food, which is certainly something that I miss. Like in Florida or in Miami, you can get a Cuban sandwich that is amazing on any street corner and any food truck. Here in Georgia, you're not going to be able to find a great Cuban sandwich. You're not going to be able to get a Cuban coffee in the window. Like, we don't have that, unfortunately, here in Georgia. And it's certainly something that I wish we had more of here in Georgia. But surprisingly, we do have quite a bit of Latin American restaurants. Some of them are good, some of them are terrible, but here in Marietta, I can think of 3 Cuban restaurants that are right around Marietta Square. So we're trying to get to a point where we have better Caribbean food. We certainly are getting more of a Caribbean influence here in Georgia as people are moving to Georgia from Florida, but we're not quite there yet. For the most part, you're going to get Southern kind of foods, lots of fried foods. We do have quite a bit of farm to table restaurants. That's becoming more and more popular here in Georgia. But there's no question that some of the food in the restaurants is different here in Georgia than it is in Florida. It seems that a lot of people are surprised that Georgia has a lot of outdoor activities. I know a lot of times people who come from Florida are very used to the outdoors. There's lots of sun and fun there in Florida, but here in Georgia, we also have lots of outdoor activities as well. It's certainly not the same as Florida. We don't have the beaches that you would expect in Florida. We don't have those here in Georgia, but there's no question that with the amount of nature and green space that we have here in Florida, there really are a lot of things to do in nature here as well. Because of the amount of trees and woods that you find here in Georgia, it's very common to have some nature preserves around the state that are great for experiencing nature or bringing the kids to kind of get a good feel for what you can find in nature. Also, we have the Chattahoochee River, which really provides a lot of outdoor activities. Near Cobb County, we have Lake Allatoona, and near Gwinnett County, we have Lake Lanier, which are the 2 biggest lakes in all of Georgia. And then on the coast of Georgia, which is not very long, we have some beaches that would be near Savannah, Georgia, which keep in mind, though, that the beaches there in Savannah are not like beaches in Florida. They're not sandy beaches that are relaxing. It's not that kind of beach in Savannah. It's really more of a rugged coast. The beaches there have not been preserved, so it's not really the same, but we do have that kind of coastline in Savannah to be able to experience the nature that you would find on the coast. Okay, let's talk about the traffic here in Georgia and how it compares to Florida, because a lot of times people move from Florida to get away from that traffic. And yes, we certainly do have a lot of traffic here in Georgia, but the difference between the traffic here in Georgia and in Florida is that in Florida, it's mainly on the interstate systems. It's mainly on like the major highways. So Interstate 75, 85, Highway 400, 285, really those major interstates are where you're going to find the majority of the traffic. And when people here in Georgia complain about how much traffic we have here in Georgia, they're really just talking about the traffic on those interstates. It is during rush hour, and it can be as well during times that are not rush hour, but it seems like in Florida, that traffic is often found not only on I-95 or the Turnpike, it's also on the roads that are not major highways. It's also on the side streets. So that's certainly a big difference between the traffic patterns in Florida and in Georgia. Really, if you're not on the highway, if you're just riding around town to a grocery store or to school, there's not nearly as much traffic in those parts of the city. And then a big reason why many people move to Georgia from Florida is to be closer to the North Georgia mountains. In Florida, I think it's very common for people to vacation at one of the beaches around Florida. Here in Georgia, it's more common to vacation in the North Georgia mountains. So a very different feel there. Again, we don't really have very many beaches here in Georgia. The closest beach to Metro Atlanta, and really the best beach, is probably going to be like Destin, Florida, or somewhere on the Gulf Coast. Fort Walton Beach is another common one. Panama City Beach, maybe. But really the more common place for people to vacation here is the North Georgia mountains. So areas like Blue Ridge or Ellijay or Helen, that part of Georgia is really picturesque, especially during the fall. It's like the entire landscape is covered in the changing of the leaves and the colors. It's red and orange and brown and yellow all over the place in North Georgia during the fall. And that's certainly one of the highlights of living in Georgia. A common question that I get from people who are looking to buy a home in Georgia, but they still need to sell a home in Florida is, how do you make that transition smoothly? How do you sell a home in Florida and home search in Georgia simultaneously if you can't be in both places at the same time? And the answer to that question is that we do typically like a virtual showing, or we do like a FaceTime or Zoom call for doing the showings of homes. So what we do is virtual showings of homes. We'll kind of come up with a list of homes that you're interested in or that you want to see, and I'll drive out to those homes and I'll call you, whether it's FaceTime or Zoom, and we'll kind of have a video call so that you can see the home from Florida and you can get a much better feel for what the home looks like as we walk through it. Another really good tool that we use to make that transition smoother is that when we submit an offer here on a home, we include a home sale contingency. And this states that you're not obligated to buy the home here in Georgia unless the home that you're selling in Florida sells. And we make this contingency all the way through the entire term of the offer. So whatever date we're closing on the home that you are purchasing here in Georgia, if your home in Florida has not sold, by that date, you're not obligated to purchase the home and you would be able to keep your deposit. So those are just some of the tools that we use to kind of alleviate the stress of selling a home in one state and buying a home in another state. Of course, if you're thinking about moving to Georgia and you're not sure where to start, check out this video. I'll see you there.